Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. It's Saturday, November 25th, 2023. We hope that everyone had a good holiday. As you can see, we're not at the church today because due to Thanksgiving, the church has limited hours. So we're back to the online format. So we hope it's a nice change before we go back into person next week, because we'll be back at the church next week. But today we're going to talk about a new and emerging peace movement and what that means for this country and a new democracy. So without further ado, I'll hand it to Doc, who will begin the discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot, Emily, and good morning to everybody. I hope, like Emily, I hope everybody had a nice holiday. I know we in the free school did. It was quite a day of turkey and fried chicken and pies and just everything, including a party of dancing and Soul Train lines where some people did two-handed flips in the Soul Train line. But I won't mention any names. But anyway, I guess there's no more appropriate time than the time we're living through to talk about a new world peace movement and a new world democracy. To even think or speak of the future, it is necessary to understand this crisis. And by understanding it, I mean that we do not just understand it as a passing moment. In other words, like the mainstream media kind of talks about the Gaza genocide, what they will say is that, well, who will rule Gaza after Israel, quote unquote, destroys Hamas, which doesn't look like they're destroying Hamas as much as they're carrying out a genocide, a murderous genocide against innocent people, in particular, babies and children and young people and defenseless people. That is not the question at all. I think the more important questions are not whether the Palestinian and Gazan people will survive, but will the Israeli state itself survive? There are growing indications that even in this moment of the most heightened propaganda on the part of the Israeli government and the US government, that growing numbers of Israeli people are speaking out against this war, against this genocide, and saying that they want their family members back, and Israel, the Israeli government and military are threatening the lives of the hostages. So it is not whether or not Hamas will survive, but whether the Israeli government will survive. That in itself is a marker for and an indication of the depth of the crisis. And of course, the Netanyahu government, and in particular, its far-right Nazi part, are committed to carrying out this war as long as possible as a way of keeping Netanyahu in power and ultimately preventing him from being put on trial and sent to jail. So war is a political tactic of the far-right / Nazi elements of Israeli society and of the Israeli government. And I think world humanity, including hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Americans, have arrived at a conclusion that the Israeli government is no better than and looks very similar to the Hitler regime in Germany. I would agree with that assessment, and the longer this goes on, the more people arrive at that conclusion, and even concluding that there will never be peace in the Middle East and never be peace between the Palestinian and Israeli people until the Israeli regime is undone. Just a small thing, you know, international law going back over 50 years since the so-called Six-Day War, where Israel took large parts of Jordan and Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt, and began a long process of occupation of Palestinian lands. Inscribed in international law and Security Council and General Assembly resolutions is that the only real resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a two-state solution where Israel withdraws to the borders prior to the Six-Day War in 1967. So when you hear diplomats calling for a two-state solution, what they are appealing to is existing international law. Some people say, well, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's a slogan emerging from certain parts of the peace movement, but that is not the position that international law will uphold. And so from a diplomatic standpoint, international law calls for Israel to withdraw from occupied territories going back to 1967, and for within those borders of Israel, a two-state, a Palestinian state would emerge in the West Bank, all of the West Bank, all of Gaza, and that presumably the Palestinian people would have free and internationally organized elections to choose who will be their government. Obviously, the Palestinian Authority has lost a lot of legitimacy among Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank, but also that Hamas and other organizations that have led the resistance have gained in legitimacy among Palestinian people. But to work that out, it would be necessary to have elections. But the key thing is that Israel withdraw to 1967 borders. We have never been closer to that being realized in the 50-some years since the Israeli war against the Arab nations in 1967. We're closer to that now. And the diplomatic conditions in the world have sidelined the United States as the key player diplomatically in the Middle East. And this is what is really throwing them off and driving them crazy. The United States thought that it could, first of all, divide the Muslim and Arab world between, quote, moderates and, quote, radicals by their definition, and that the US would be the key negotiator in whatever went on between Arabs and Israelis and Palestinians. I can't tell you how big this has been. And of course, the U.S. role has been over the last 55, 56 years, nothing but obstruction and arming of Israel beyond anything that Israel needs to defend itself. We cannot speak enough about that. So any Israeli war against Arabs is ultimately an American war, a proxy war against Arabs and Muslims. And I want to get to the broader Muslim thing. Well, let me just get to that right now. You see, Islam is not one thing. Islam is not just Arab nations. Arabs are not only Muslims, but they're Christians, and there's small groups of Jews among Arabs. But then there is Sunni Islam as a broad category, which does not define the politics of a nation. For example, Egypt and Turkey are Sunni nations. That is, the majority of believers adhere to the Sunni tenets of Islam. But that having been said, Turkey and Egypt are very different. Modern day Turkey was previously the Ottoman Empire, you know, and the Ottomans culturally and civilizationally are more similar to the Turkic-speaking people in Central Asia and parts of Russia. That's why it's called Turkey, because of the language, the Turkic language. The Egyptian Sunni Muslims speak Arabic. Arabic is the language. Arabic is an Afro-Asiatic language, you know, which emerges out of that conjunction, that point of civilizational conjunction of North Africa and West Asia. The other thing is that Turkey, having been an empire, the Ottoman Empire, up until the conclusion of World War I, when Turkey had a democratic revolution led by a man by the name of Ataturk. Turkey is a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Egypt was never that. It was considered a part, not of the, quote, developed nations, the EU, NATO, aligned with the United States against the Soviet Union, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Egypt has never been in that position. However, on this question, the two Muslim nations are united. But even more is the great Shia power, Shia Islamic power in Iran. Iran, modern day Iran, is the inheritor, in a certain sense, of the Persian Empire, which influenced parts of India, parts of China, Russia. And so there are Shia Muslims far beyond the borders of Iran. But now we have this joining of Sunni nations where, for example, in Turkey, Erdogan, the president, declares himself and presents himself as a devout Muslim, you know, which is both religion and civilization. Raisi, the president of Iran, presents himself as a devout Shia Muslim, as does al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, as a devout Sunni Muslim. But then from the standpoint of the West and the United States, to add insult to injury, the major Sunni nation, because it is the protector of the holy sites of Islam, Saudi Arabia, last spring united with the great Shia power, who the West was hoping would these two Muslim nations would always be at odds. Here you get the former Ottoman Empire, which colonized much of what we call Western Asia, many of the modern day states, including Syria, Lebanon, to a certain extent, Jordan, have come out of the former Ottoman Empire, which, if you want to go back further, is the old Roman Empire. And of course, the Crusades, which we won't get all into right now. But here you have a former colonial power in the Ottoman Empire, now Turkey, Sunni Muslim, united with Egypt, a nation which variously had been occupied, colonized by Western nations, especially Britain, but also, I think, to a certain extent, the Ottoman Empire. These two united, and then they're united with Saudi Arabia, and all of them united with Iran. Now, this is deeper than just ideology, statecraft, and other things, because Turkey is a major military power, as is Iran. Over the last 30 years at least, Iran has built up one of the most sophisticated, technologically advanced militaries in the whole world, as is the case with Turkey. Israel and the United States' trump card was always to threaten Iran, not Turkey so much as the Arab nations and Iran, with the threat of complete destruction, including nuclear destruction of their societies, if they dared to attack Israel. Well, when we look at the military balance, even Israel's nuclear arsenal could not deter the missile capabilities of Turkey and Iran. That Iran alone, with what it has, could destroy Israel as a nation. And possibly through its missile defense, Iran's missile defense capability, deter nuclear weapons coming from Israel towards Iran. But no one wants that. But I think in the calculus that we're now looking at, not only are Israel and the United States isolated, a point I want to come back to, and they are. They have never, in 75 years, been this isolated. Israel always had the sympathy of large parts of the world, including large parts of the Muslim world, for what happened in the Holocaust, what the German Nazis did to the European Jews. Many in the socialist community felt that Jews coming from Europe and Russia would be socialist, that a socialist state in alliance or side by side, a socialist Jewish state side by side with a potential socialist Palestinian state would create a zone of peace and progress in the Middle East. However, the Zionists, and this history of Zionism, which we don't have time to go into right now, its evolutions to what it has become, the Zionists had a different perspective. They wanted to settle and establish a colonial, imperialist, and capitalist state at odds with the rest of the Middle East and with the financial, military, and other backing of the United States. This didn't happen all at once. There were, in the Truman administration in the late 40s, there was a lot of skepticism about a state of Israel because they felt it would be aligned to the Soviet Union. And that was a possibility. And that's what Du Bois and others were seeing as well. But things went another way, which gradually led to what we have today. And gradually, the world saying to Israel, our hearts were open to you as victims of this horrendous crime of Nazism, right. But our empathy and our sympathy for you does not mean that we don't have a moral grounding, and that what you are now doing and what you have been doing to the Palestinians is a morally equivalent. And I want to use the word moral equivalency, because things don't always have to be moral equivalent to, things don't have to be equivalent in quantitative terms to be a moral equivalency. Moral equivalency has to do more with what is a moral law, what is a legal, international legal standard. But I'll come back to that. But this coming together of the Muslim world, which is very important, was manifested about a week and a half ago at a meeting of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where 57 Arab and Muslim majority nations signed on to a singular declaration declaring the call for a ceasefire, which is against the interest of Israel, because they want Gaza, they want to push all the Palestinians out of Gaza, and those who don't leave, they want to kill. The call for a ceasefire is a call for an end to the Israeli aggression. That's fundamentally what it is. They did not condemn Hamas, but they called for a two-state solution. 57 heads of government and heads of state, 57, constituting the the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, signed on to this, 57. Then the BRICS nation, BRICS plus 6, the 6 nations that recently joined BRICS. And they are heavily weighted towards Muslim nations: Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. 4 of the most important nations in Western Asia, North Africa. They sit on top of a lot of oil, but also they manage major straits and canals for the transport of oil and other things from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and down the South Atlantic. In the case of Egypt, the Suez Canal, In the case of Iran, the Straits of Hormuz. Shut the Straits of Hormuz down, you shut down 30% of the oil that comes into world markets and that fuels, you know, the economies of the world. So war with Iran is in effect a war with the world economy. It is a war on the world economy. Now, if the United States and Israel want to take it there, they will have to be held responsible for its economic, political, and other consequences. But it's not, the United States has sent aircraft carriers and submarines equipped with nuclear tipped missiles and all of this to the Red Sea and to Western Mediterranean, and this show of gunboat diplomacy is supposed to intimidate everybody. But what happened is nobody got intimidated. It's literally like them saying, well, bring it on. Let's see if you can survive our weapons. And an aircraft carrier is a sitting duck anyway. I don't know why they still have those things. They don't, and with what Iran has, what Turkey has, even what Hezbollah has, but we'll come back to that. But then the BRICS nations come out with a statement. Of course they would, given BRICS +6. But then South Africa, to everybody's joy and some surprise, at least for me, given some other things, has come to the fore in this whole thing, kicking the Israeli, breaking diplomatic relations with Israel. Really huge. Okay. Kicking, unceremoniously kicking the Israeli ambassador and everybody associated with Israeli consulates out of the country. Now, Israel, knowing that this was coming because it was a vote in the South African parliament, where 80% of the members of South Africa's parliament voted to kick the Israeli ambassador out and break diplomatic relations. Well, the Israelis, we're not going to let you black N-words kick us out. We're going to leave before you can do that.
Right.
Hometown, so what?
Yeah,
the same effect, get out.
Yeah.
Then in South America, several nations downgraded the diplomatic presence of Israel in their countries, including Colombia, of course, Venezuela. I'm not certain. I think Peru kicked the Israeli ambassador out, broke diplomatic relations. And see, let me just say what this means. When you break diplomatic relations, it means that nations are in a hostile relation with each other. Does that make sense? It is a statement of unbridgeable hostilities. That's one. The fact that nations, and I don't know the number at this time, are breaking diplomatic ties with Israel are very important. Saudi Arabia has said all talks leading towards a rapprochement with Israel are off. That's ended. Even Jordan, which in some ways is a vassal state of Israel and the United States, withdrew its diplomats from Israel. Okay. Now, on top of all of this, and I think I remember all of it thus far, you have the Chinese becoming the major player and diplomatic player in this whole thing, pushing the U.S. to the side. And the Chinese government operates with the goodwill of the majority of the world's nations. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the Arab League, and others have not contested China's role as a fair player in this whole situation. You might say impartial, that as diplomats, they can be trusted in ways that the United States can no longer be trusted. This is huge again, because the United States believes that it should be the diplomat par excellence of matters in the Middle East because of their relationship with Israel. Now China is replacing them. Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, has called for a world peace conference.
Yeah.
When, where, how, the details are not clear. But it is not a remote idea of a World Peace Council. The conditions are ripe for it. Whether it will occur under the UN auspices or whether something else, it's hard to say. But China and Russia have been very active in the UN General Assembly and in the UN Security Council. A few weeks ago, Russia introduced a resolution for a ceasefire. The West, led by the United States, vetoed it. Then the small island nation of Malta, who I think currently is the chairman of the Security Council, introduced a humanitarian pause without limits, which is a ceasefire maybe. And it passed the UN Security Council with the United States and maybe Britain abstaining. And Russia abstained on the basis that it did not include a ceasefire, but it was not opposed in substance to a prolonged humanitarian pause. Okay, now that's the UN Security Council. At other levels, where the West doesn't have veto power, they've gone far beyond what could be realized in the UN Security Council. However, a couple of weeks before the Security Council passed the Maltese resolution, the General Assembly voted 120, a little bit more, to 44 abstentions or not showing up, and 14 opposing, passed a resolution for a ceasefire. But because the General Assembly does not have mechanisms of enforcement of their resolutions, it is just a statement of the views of the majority of nations. The Security Council, sadly, is where the power of enforcement rests. However, 120, 44 abstentions. Why the abstentions? You'd have to go to the various nations, you know. But only 14 nations voted against it. And among the 14 that voted against it are small micronations like Micronesia in the Pacific that, you know, are literally live off of US donations. So if they don't vote with the United States, they go hungry for a month. You know what I'm saying? U.S. cuts them off. But all of the major powers, constituting probably 90% of the world's population, voted for a ceasefire. But that's at the level of states. But what about the level of people? And here we have something very important happening. And I think this is a common, united peace sentiment, pro-Palestinian sentiment among the majority and of the 8 billion people on the planet. The weight of humanity is against Israel, against the United States, and against imperialist control of the world and the world's population. This is a rupture, a break, unprecedented in the history of the world since the end of World War II, where the people of the world, in their billions, are, I believe, deciding the future of the world, more than what states do, although the two are interconnected. Every day, throughout the world and in almost every country of the world, there are demonstrations against the Israeli genocide and increasingly in favor of the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to resist oppression. I would like to say resistance to oppression is not always a pretty thing, because oppression is not pretty. And there are a lot of emotions tied up in the relationships between the oppressors and the oppressed. Nowhere more intense than among the Palestinians. Now, of course, you know, you hear people say, well, I'm against, well, this is not the main line of the demonstrators. I'm against what Israel is doing, but I'm also against what Hamas did. To which I always ask the question, well, what did Hamas do? Because I like to know. And maybe you know something that I don't know. One thing we do know, and this is hugely important, that not only did Hamas and its allied resistance fighters overcome the technological conditions of the containment of the Gazan people, that is, you know, everything from drones flying over constantly, surveillance cameras, the electronic wall, several walls of fence and so on. I mean, it's nowhere has there been such a containment and control of 2.3 million people. Not even the Nazi concentration camps were this controlled and such. They overcame that. And by the way, you know, when we discussed that front page article a few weeks ago in the New York Times, where they were trying to figure out how this happened, I think one conclusion that they might have, the Israelis may have reached, the Israeli government and military, and others, is that there had to be people inside the Israeli military that betrayed the military. Now, this could have been, you know, anti-Netanyahu forces who wanted a crisis that would bring him down. There could be people in the Israeli government and Israeli military who went from pro-war to pro-peace and are disgusted with what Israel is doing to Gaza and the West Bank, who oppose the Nazi elements in Israel, who want all Palestinians pushed out of the West Bank, Gaza, and this idea of a greater Israel. But I am of the opinion that Hamas had too much information not to have had information supplied to them from within the Israeli government. They knew where to go, they knew how to attack, they knew where the intelligence centers, nodes were around Gaza. They knew even where to go and get the computers that had all the information. But then, and this is what is quite significant, and it remains even in the military situation in Gaza at this time, that, and I got this from Scott Ritter, that Hamas took on and routed. The word routed, we mean had them running for their lives. Some of the most professional, hardened, best trained elements in the Israeli army, the so-called Galanti brigades, who had fought in most of the wars, had fought in Lebanon against Hezbollah. So they're hardened, they're well organized. Hamas stepped to them and forced them to flee. They were routed. And then they went on, Hamas that is, and the allied resistance fighters, to take over at least 8 Israeli military bases around Gaza. Okay? So the first targets, this is why I always ask, well, what did Hamas do? Do you know what they did? Then they took on the armed and militarized kibbutzes. These are the extreme elements of Israeli society. Again, I use the N-word, Nazi elements. They're highly armed and they exist for the purpose, in a certain sense, of if there is an uprising in Gaza, these people from these kibbutzes would go into Gaza and kill people wholesale. That's what they exist for. When Hamas stepped to these kibbutzim, they heavily began to go into battle against Hamas, and most of them lost. By the time the Israeli military arrived and got itself back together, by the way, the Israeli military has not gotten itself back together. The Israeli military just went buck wild crazy, firing on everything that they thought was Hamas, and it's estimated that now they brought it down to 12. Remember, it was 1,400 killed. Now it's down to 1,200. I ain't explain why it's less now. But anyway, the Israeli army killed something like 200 of its own people. Israeli citizens know this happened. The Israeli government fired on its own military forces, presuming that Hamas was all, up in there, trying to kill Hamas. They killed their own people. They killed a lot of innocent citizens. Now, I don't know the geography of what went on in that concert, partying, drinking, doing cocaine, whatever they were doing, partying, like it's 1999, to quote Prince. And whether or not Hamas or just random Palestinians who said, now I'm going to get revenge. You killed my mother in 2015. Now I'm going to kill you. And that you can't control. Once the gate, the fence was broached, people just went through, and that's the Frantz Fanon situation of the cleansing. I have to avenge my mother so that she can rest in peace. My father will not forgive me if I do not avenge my mother's death. You know, that type of thing. And that is, there is support for that type of view in certain readings of the Holy Quran. But that was not Hamas. Hamas is not ISIS. And here I have a complete disagreement with Alexander Makuris and the Duran and with Brian Berletic. You know, that there is somehow a direct lineal connection between Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Israeli Netanyahu's government, and ISIS. I don't think that's the case. Obviously, by what they were able to carry out militarily, and again, using asymmetric warfare, mobility, and other things to defeat the Israeli army. They are not another Muslim Brotherhood organization. They are not an Islamic organization in that sense. And let's be real, Hamas has made important and disastrous mistakes on the world scale, most significantly their position against Assad in Syria. You know, but anyway, that's for another day. That doesn't define October 7th. Now, the military situation is very, very important because in understanding the military situation, the world is able to recognize the intensity of Palestinian resistance. And just like Erdogan, the president of Turkey, said, Hamas is not a terrorist organization. It is a national liberation movement. That is basically what the South African government said. We see Hamas as a brother national liberation movement. Hamas, however, has no standing under international law at this point, but that's not consequential. People see a just struggle. And frankly, what South Africa will argue as it takes Israel to the International Criminal Court, which it is doing, is that not only is this an attack upon the civilians of Gaza, it is an attack upon freedom and the right to resist and the struggle for national liberation. Just to make a point, the concept of the right to self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter and in international law. This is not made up and so on. And so for nations such as those in Latin America, such as those in Africa and other places, saying that the struggle of the Palestinian and Gazan peoples is a just struggle, and I underline just, in the sense of just and unjust war. You see what I'm saying? Just and unjust war. And when diplomats use it, they are using it in the framework of international law. Okay. The US and Israel are totally isolated. The Israeli army suffered. They say, oh, the 1,400 or 1,200 people, Israel has never suffered this level of casualties in its history. And not since the Holocaust have so many Israelis been killed. You see what I'm saying? You know, the deep structure of the argument itself suggests that the Israelis have the right to kill because they've killed far more than 1,200 or 1,400 Palestinians and other Arabs over its 75-year history. But the defeat that the Israeli army and some of its best detachments and units suffered on October 7th took at least a month for the Israeli army and political structure to regroup, to mount a, quote, offensive against Hamas in Gaza. In the meantime, while the army is regrouping, the Air Force, supplied with new missiles, new drone and missiles by the United States, waged a genocide against the Palestinian people. That genocide itself was a manifestation of the desperation of the Israeli military and government. They went crazy, and they are still crazy. And you know, I'm often quoting this: whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad. The Israeli regime has gone completely crazy. And that's why the regime and the state is so fragmented and split. And Israeli society is so split that one wonders, once this war is over, and I'm going to explain what I mean when the war is over, can the Israeli state survive? The other side of that is, will the American people put up with billions of dollars going to Israel to kill Palestinians? Will the American people? I'm going to suggest no, they won't. And they will cast Biden out of office before they let more billions go to kill Palestinians. Okay? But the Israelis went crazy and they killed everything that was moving. They bombed hospitals, and the world was watching. And it is their arrogance to think that they have so much control over the US and world media, that they have the moral high ground, so they thought, that they had the right to take revenge by bombing hospitals, by bombing children, and people have seen these children. The world will never forget it. But it is hubris, and it is madness to continue this, where, you know, like in any situation, you face an existential crisis in life, you know, the imminence of death, let us say. You know, you have options in the way you handle that crisis. You can go mad. You can act like a crazy person. You know, say, okay, I have an imminent crisis. I'm going to die soon. Let me shoot all the heroin I can. Right. You know, or you can say, I will live with purpose. Israel sees no future for itself. And the more the world has turned on Israel, the more vicious they have become. A sign of madness, a sign of desperation. The Gazan people are suffering. The young Shaheed, the martyrdom. And every death in Gaza is the death of a martyr. And the world understands that. These are people and children and babies dying for the cause of the freedom of their people. This is hugely important. So now, Gazans and Palestinians have the moral high ground in the global narrative. This is a huge shift, a huge shift. Okay, So the Israelis eventually have gone into Gaza. But it's not like they rushed up in there. They went in, came out, went in again. They were trying to gauge their military operations based upon what Hamas did. They don't know where Hamas is. They know they're in underground tunnels, but they're in other places. Hamas and the Israelis don't reveal the deaths of their soldiers. But so many people are saying that that the losses are unacceptable in terms of what Israelis expect. You know, again, they have been socialized to believe that they can kill and will kill and never die. This idea of invincibility, which is built into the political culture of Israel. Now you will die, and you are dying. And your technology cannot escape our maneuverability. You're going in there with tanks like you're fighting a conventional army.
Right.
And we're waging non-conventional or asymmetric warfare. In other words, we can draw you in as a trap and then surround you and destroy your tank. You know, so you're responding to us, the guerrilla fighters, and we're not responding to you. That's why Israel would go in there with all that big willy talk, and all they can kill are civilians. Because the military is waiting its time, biding its time, and will force the stronger army to respond to them. That's been going on the whole history of people's war, of guerrilla war. That's the playbook. But when you're too arrogant, and by the way, it's questionable whether or not a determined asymmetric army can even be defeated. We don't know that it's ever been defeated. It wasn't defeated. The People's Liberation Army in China wasn't defeated, and they were asymmetric. The Vietnamese were not defeated. The Koreans were not, and all of them were asymmetric. And all of them were heavily bombed. North Korea, what they did there, Vietnam, and so it's questionable whether a determined people's guerrilla army can be defeated, because the record is they're always winning. And in this case, Hamas, which has anywhere from 30 to 40,000 fighters, and they're not all men, by the way, men and women, above ground and in tunnels, insinuated in with the Gazan people. New shaheeds are created, a new militancy, a new anger, a new commitment by the Gazan people to resist, to attack Israel. You know, they're hidden in the rubble. They're hidden in tunnels, you know, and the determination. See, this is the psychological dimension. First of all, the Gazans know that the world is with them. So if I die, I will not have died in vain. I will be known to the world for my sacrifice. You know what I'm saying? And they know that now. And every young person in Gaza that can do anything against the Israelis are going to do it. Tens of thousands new Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other organizations, tens of thousands of new recruits have come into their ranks. But this is the history of people's warfare.
Mm.
Once the guerrilla forces, if they can survive the first wave of attacks upon them, you know what I'm saying? Like the bombing you see in Gaza, like the Israeli army coming into Gaza. Once they survive the first blows of the enemy, they get stronger. It's a dialectical process. And so that's what is happening. Now, there are people who know military matters who are saying that Israel will be defeated in Gaza. I agree with that opinion. The Israeli army will be defeated. The defeat will not just be because of the military operations of Hamas, but because the politics in Israel will increasingly begin to say, we want our hostages back, but we also don't want our sons and daughters to die in a senseless genocidal war in Gaza. So you get two psychologies where the Gazans are saying, bring it on. We want to fight you. If you think you can kill us without dying, we have another thing to tell you. So you get a high motivation on the Palestinian side and a low motivation on the Israeli side.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, frankly, it's a beautiful thing to see. Now, Hezbollah, the party of God. Hezbollah, since 2006, when they defeated the Israelis went up into Lebanon, and they're going to destroy Hezbollah. Went up there and suffered a terrible defeat. They don't want to mess with Hezbollah. I mean, it's just that simple. And Hezbollah now has almost as many missiles as Israel has. The thing about missiles, increasingly warfare is fought with missiles, long-range, guided, accurate missiles, and with drones, and so rather than even planes. Hezbollah has both the military capability to fight a conventional war with Israel, but also the capacity to fight an asymmetric war with Israel. But it also has the technological capacity to reach Tel Aviv and other major cities in Israel. So if Israel thinks that it can wage a war on two fronts, that is Gaza and Israel's northern border with Hezbollah, they don't have it. They don't have the backing of the Israeli people, nor is the Israeli army motivated to die. For what, they say, and rightfully so. For what? But if that were not enough, Israel is looking at a three-front war. Gaza, determined resistance fighters, and I mean, it's hard to, it's the quality, the human factor. Gaza, Hamas, and the allied organizations are pumped up and ready to fight the Israeli army. And understand, and this is what is hugely important, that what they do can reshape the world's relationships between nations and people. A defeat of unprecedented proportions for an imperialist power like the United States and its proxy, Israel, a defeat of that magnitude is world historic. And Hamas knows it. It motivates them to fight. And then you have Hezbollah looking at the same thing. To defeat the Israeli army is to liberate those parts of Lebanon that have been occupied by Israel since 1967. Okay? Now the West Bank. The West Bank is governed and ruled by thugs and Nazis who have set up settlements and who are heavily armed and regularly kill, brutalize, rape, imprison Palestinians on the West Bank. Yeah. Now an uprising on the West Bank. So you got three fronts. Then you got standing in the background, Iran and Turkey, two of the most powerful militaries in the world. Okay? Whose leadership is committed to the defeat of Israel. Then, of course, all of the diplomatic moves that I've spoken about. Now, but here is what was unexpected. No one could have seen it coming in this form. The rise of a movement in the United States. You know, we in the Free School had said the American people are more anti-war than they were at the height of the Vietnam War struggle. Well, you know, only by looking at certain polls and by a sense of the American people could we project that or think that way. But now the evidence is in. Every day in the United States, there's a demonstration, a rally, whatever, in support of a ceasefire, which is in actuality increasingly support for the Palestinian people. Increasingly, the American people are saying, and for the first time, the struggle of the Palestinian people is a just struggle. The Israelis are an oppressor and they're carrying out genocide. People are going to jail. Huge marches, State Department officials, congressional interns, all over the place. People are resigning from their jobs, writing long letters with hundreds of State Department officials condemning the Biden administration. And then these college campuses, 34 organizations at Harvard, at Cornell, at the University of Pennsylvania. So much so that the state, the Biden administration, is going after the students, called them anti-Semitic, although a big part of them are Jewish and such. Then you have the emergence of Jewish Voices for Peace that has gone to the front of the struggle against the Israeli government. And this is hugely important because you take away from the Zionists one of its key claims, that all Jews are united behind Israel. Now you get Jewish Voices for Peace saying, no, we're not united behind Israel. We're united behind the Palestinian struggle. Jews, young Jewish people, you know, and then Jewish people, the Jewish community in the United States, again, a very powerful community, only about 2%, 3% of the whole population, but at the level of the elites, almost dominant in certain areas. the Jewish establishment, ADL and all of that, American Jewish Congress, the influence of Jews and Zionists in Hollywood and the academy and banking and all of that has meant nothing to the student movement and to Jewish Voices for Peace. This is unprecedented. But then 70% of young people, potential voters that the Democrats and Biden need to win the election in 2024, 70% of 18 to 35, 39 years old people are against Biden's policy of embracing Israel. And it's not similar, but in other age cohorts, it's an opposition that we've never seen. Then, on top of that, a poll comes out. And I think we mentioned this a couple free schools ago. 70% of those polled said they would not fight in a war to defend the United States. Let's say it's not 70%. Let's say it's 60%. You can't build a war-fighting army for perpetual war when over half of the people do not support war and are saying, we ain't gonna study war no more. Do something about the crisis here in this country. But that young population is very important also because they become the recruits into the army, into the Air Force, the military, you know what I'm saying? If 70% of them have turned against U.S. foreign policy. Richard Haass, as we have mentioned, was absolutely right. He said, I'm not kept up at night thinking about, quote, foreign threats to U.S. interests. He said the greatest threat to U.S. interests, which is to be read, U.S. military and imperialist foreign policy, the greatest threat is from within the United States. Homeboy could never have been more accurate, although he didn't see Gaza coming. The American people are enemies of the American war-making machine. No amount of propaganda and terrorism can change this. Let me end this. This is what I'm kind of leading up to. All of these variables and elements considered, what is emerging is a world peace movement of a new type. This is quite significant and is not the same as diplomacy. The peoples of the world are driving their governments and saying that if you continue to pursue this policy of supporting genocide carried out by Israel, we will bring the government down. The Spanish and Dutch governments recently, in the last couple of days, came out attacking the Israeli government. Okay? These are European nations, members of the EU, members of NATO. The people are driving this. Biden could be driven out of office because of this. This was inconceivable. But then throughout the world humanity is saying these unjust genocidal wars have to end. And if it takes Chinese diplomacy or whatever to bring this about, so be it. If China is on the side of peace, we're on the side of China. This is big. Small, it does, it's like, how do you put it? Dynamics, where something like the Gaza genocide and China coming as a mediator for peace have created very favorable positions, very favorable attitudes of millions and millions and millions of people towards China, including in the United States. China wants peace. We want a ceasefire. China wants a ceasefire. We're more down with China than we are with our own government. While our own government wants a war with China, tension with China, okay? I call this a world peace movement of a new type, where people, the consciousness of the people of the world is at a level that we have never seen. There are elections throughout the world in 2024. Maybe the most important one is the United States. I think there's going to be one in England. India has one. This is a touchy thing. I don't know. You see, and I don't know what the polling data is showing in India, but Modi has probably lost something and will lose some support as a result of him embracing Netanyahu. It's what, we call in the Black community a hell of an Uncle Tom move. I have to say, it is disgraceful for India. Let me put it this way, the government of India, to act in this way. But there are elections, I think, in December for local state governments in India. And I just read an article which said that the Congress Party is challenging the BJP in states where the BJP has a stronghold. Well, I'm not all that down with the neoliberals and neocons in the Congress Party in India, but I'm not down with Modi also. And I think BJP needs to be spanked and wake up and say, you can't be a friend of a genocidist regime like Israel and an enemy of a peace government like China. And well, anyway, I'll stop there on that. But let me just see, I have one other, forgive me, just one other thing I want, just one other thing. Democracy and world peace. What this crisis is creating conditions for is a new global democracy where all of the regimes that claim to be democratic are now becoming more illegitimate among the peoples of the world. No nation less than the United States. Remember, out the gate, when the Biden administration came to power, the first thing they said is that our foreign policy is based on a struggle with authoritarian governments in the name of democracy. That bullshit is out the window now, as the U.S. embraces a genocidist regime in Israel, and as it tries to hold on to a corrupt neo-Nazi regime in the Ukraine. The United States does not have the moral authority to claim that it is defending democracy. So a new democracy, a new world order based on democracy, we're on the cusp of. How it will come about, it's hard to say. There perhaps will be back and forth and many disappointments. But there's no question, we moved beyond the so-called unipolar world where the United States is a so-called indispensable nation, where the rules that the United States set for the world would be would supplant international law. All that shit is over, gone. And people are looking at governments like China, like Russia, like North Korea as foundations of a new world democracy. And that the claims of the West that they represent democracy no longer hold weight with the majority of people in the world. The United States is in a crisis. As things look now, the Biden regime, which is the most warlike, neocon, anti-US people regime perhaps in our history. The worst ones, like the Nixon government, I guess to a certain extent Reagan, all of that, there's nothing that comes close to what these people are about. Provocateurs and war makers. But as they wage war abroad, they wage war against the American people. King is right. The bombs dropped in Gaza explode in poor communities all over this country. As things look, the Biden government will be brought down. The situation only gets worse for it. Its polling numbers will not increase. This is not an election about abortion. This is not an election about climate change. This is not a question. This is not an election about election denial. 2024 will be an election, the essence of which, for the people, is can the ruling class continue to rule? Can we, the people, afford for this ruling class to continue to rule? And people will decide how they will vote in the end based on that. That's all I'm going to say.
The thing that really stuck out to me, Doc, about what you said was that today there's a consciousness of the people of the world, and specifically that the consciousness that the call for ceasefire is actually increasingly a explicit recognition and call in support of the Palestinian people. I don't know. There's something I feel like really significant about the fact that the move around the world, like the world's peoples are demanding that their governments call for a ceasefire because they understand the Palestinian struggle as a just struggle. And which is to say that Israel is an oppressor. And the reason why that stood out to me is also because there's something about the Palestinian people's struggle, and even the way you're describing asymmetric warfare, that, like, I think Alice and I both got emotional at this part, but to say when you look at the Palestinian people, you can't, like, at least for me, like, you can't help but see, like, for example, like, you can't help but see the Chinese people struggle and the Palestinian people. And I was reading the call that Nandita Raju wrote for like the call that Nandatan Raju wrote for Palestine, and specifically to the Indian people, saying, how can you not recognize that the Palestinian people's struggle is the same as the Indian people's struggle against the British? And it also reminded me something about how that when you see how, especially like all the reports about hostages being freed on both sides, like a lot of the videos of the Palestinian hostages being freed from Israeli prisons are children who were imprisoned when they were 7 years old, 8 years old, 15 years old, who are now 21, 22, imprisoned when they were children because they were imprisoned as terrorists. That, what does it say? You know, and I feel like that is something that it reminded me of how you and Catherine talked about what it was like growing up to see Emmett Till so brutally murdered. And Emmett Till was a child, but he was not treated. He was not treated by this society as a child. And it reminded me so much of seeing those children finally freed from Israeli prisons, that they're not and because I see a lot of online, a lot of Zionists will say, well, they're not children, they're terrorists, they're criminals. And see, to me, the reason why I think there's something very significant about a peace movement that is new, of a new kind, is that this people's consciousness that of not just saying, oh, we want a ceasefire, but to say, well, I think the Palestinian people's struggle is just. It is human. It is a struggle for humanity. And actually, it is the Israeli government that is inhumane, is the oppressor. Actually, the Israeli government is the enemy of all humanity. And I also feel like there's something very significant about saying outright that Israel is similar to the Nazi government and that Israel is white supremacist. Like, I think there's something very important about naming what Israel is doing to the Palestinians as not just unjust and inhumane, but as genocide. Because, I think that's very significant, because what it also shows, like everything with the world movements, like the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, BRICS+6, China calling for World Peace Conference. For me, it's a call for a global democracy, like that. The reason why I feel like it's significant is that it's also it is in some ways a call for like a new era of humanity, this Afro-Asiatic reconstitution of the world. Like a world in which war can no longer exist. And like there's something, I don't know, there's something, and I feel like it also clarifies things for America, because like I found this speech earlier this morning. I was reading this speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave in 1967, I think, maybe 1968. It was a few months before his assassination, and it's not a like far published speech, because it was a speech he gave to the SCLC at their retreat. So it's an internal organizational speech, and it's called A New Direction or something like that. Like him calling for a new direction. And it was him talking to his cadre, this disciplined cadre of the SCLC. And the reason why it's published now is because Coretta Scott King gave permission for these internal speeches that he didn't give for the public, but rather gave for the cadre. Like she gave permission for those to be published. And the whole speech is King's evaluation of the American movement. And what the speech says is he explicitly says that there's stages of revolution. He says there's such thing as phases of a movement or stages of a revolution. And he says the first stage is civil rights, but the second rung of the ladder, the natural progression of the civil rights movement, is the higher stage of a peace movement. And what he's saying is that the next stage of the Black liberation struggle is actually a peace movement. And there's something very deep, because I think there's something really important about, like in some ways what I was reading it as, and this is something Du Bois I think says too, is that like King says that latent racism allows for war to continue, allows for a war society to exist. And I think that's very important, because I feel like what it's also saying, and that's why I think it's so important that the world's people is calling what's happening to the Palestinian people a genocide, to call Israel a white supremacist nation and state that itself has to be, in the Israeli state has to be saved by its own people, because it cannot be a white supremacist. Like, it needs to be purged of white supremacy. But just this thing that I feel like King's speech, his evaluation of the movement and the difficulties they were hitting, was that he was saying a lot of America was okay with civil rights, but then the next stage, the higher stage of our struggle, is that for peace, which is against war. And he said that is something that makes our movement much more dangerous to society. And it's all to say that I think the continuation of white supremacy is why war is still able to happen. And then King also quoted, and I think this applies also to how the world's people are seeing Israel and Palestine, which is, rather than blaming Hamas, like what you said, where people want to say, what people always want to make it about, like, okay, what Israel is doing is bad, but also Hamas is bad. But then King, he quotes Victor Hugo, and he says, if the soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. So the guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who creates the darkness. Yeah, and it's talking about he's basically saying that moral criteria of Israel is the one who creates the darkness. And so it is he, the Israeli government, it is those who fund genocide, who fund this genocidal government, who creates the darkness where sins are committed. And then the last thing I wanted to say is, like, I think it's so what you said also, that the 2024 election in America, and of course, I think it's so significant that there are world elections happening too, but that the American election will be one of whether the ruling elite will be allowed to continue to rule, whether the ruling elite essentially is given the mandate, or will they be defeated, or will the people say that there's no more mandate for you to rule us. Because I just think, like, honestly, recently I've just really been into Candace Owens in particular. And the reason why is because there's something she said in her interview with Tucker Carlson, where she said, in some ways to saying that the 2024 election is whether the ruling elite can rule, is also saying that you see, even in the American people, that their compass is no longer defined by identity politics or wokeness or liberalism or, like, what's it called, virtue signaling of progress, but rather, I think the American people increasingly, because of what Israel is doing to Palestine, and the Biden administration's position on it, is increasingly the American people across many different sections or movements in the US, their criteria is around war and peace. And I feel like that is important, because Candace Owens, when she was talking to Tucker Carlson, said she was giving her assessment of the 2024 election, specifically around Trump. And she said, all the people like Ron DeSantis who are never Trumpers, all the people, Republicans who are never Trumpers, she says, have you noticed that it is them, the never Trumpers, the people who will never back Trump, who are also the same people who will never challenge the military industrial complex? And she said that. She used those words. She said, it is those who will never support Trump who are also forever going to support war, who are the war hawks. And even Candace Owens, like, whatever she represents, the people she speaks to, that section of the quote unquote racist, fascist right, far right, who Joe Sims says support concentration camps in the US, those who support Trump, like Candace Owens, support concentration camps. What it shows is that whoever the movement of the section of the Trump movement that Candace Owens speaks to, represents, and I even think Candace Owens speaks to a lot of Black people, that because Candace Owens, she also compared Israel to Jim Crow South. What she was saying was that the last time we saw a government that was this white supremacist was those who ruled the South, Jim Crow South. Because she said, she was like, what I see in Jerusalem ruled by Israel is what my grandfather, when he was lived in the segregated South, what he talked about. And so this is all to say that, like, in America too, there's a new delineation or a new orientation of how people even view the world in America. Like, there's a new moral criteria. And I think there's just something very important about what King said, where he said that the second stage of the American people's movement, one that we are picking up, comes from the Black liberation, comes from the Civil Rights decade. And yeah, and I don't want to talk too much, but I really, actually, that speech was very illuminating, because he also talks about the youth. He evaluates the youth. And that's what we in the Free School do too, which is to say, at the end of the day, we must know where the youth are. And he says, he even gives an explicit evaluation where he says, there are 3 sections of the youth, and here's what motivates each of them. And here are their strengths and their possible contributions to a peace movement. And then here are also their downfalls and their temptations. And he says the youth are made up of, I forget the first. I think it was young people who are disillusioned, or young people who are not comfortable taking any stand, but who have been morally influenced by, especially the Black youth who have taken stands. And then the second section are the college educated radicals, who he says are struggling to find a new language and a new framework, which he's saying that they need to find it from Black people. But he's saying that what's good about them is that they will not accept old forms of rule, that they're looking for a new system. And that is significant. And then this third section he calls the hippies. He says it is the hippies who do not want to accept responsibility, but instead just want to express their dissatisfaction. And he says, but what is positive about them is that as hippies, they have a dream. He says a dream is not enough, but that they're dreamers of something better. He's trying to appeal to, he's basically appealing to the college campus hippie dippies. And yeah, I just think there's something very deep about that speech, because what he's doing is he's specifically trying to prepare the cadre for the Poor People's Movement, which was supposed to launch that fall, which he could not live to see. And he's giving and I've never heard King talk like that, because the speeches that we read are the ones he's giving to the mass movement. And what he said is the only logical conclusion is that, to meet that all 3 sections of the youth who are the future, that the way they can be harnessed in a creative way is to bring them to the higher stage of mass civil disobedience against war and for peace. And that's what he says. He says we can appeal to all 3 sections of the youth with mass civil disobedience, and that he was trying to make the case for the Poor People's Movement. And in some ways, I think it speaks to today, where there are all these different sections who have Candace Owens, the Trump movement, or the American people who who in some ways are not explicitly taking a stand, but are dissatisfied, upset, or the young radicals. There are many different sections who all must be taken to a higher stage of struggle that humanity is already bringing them into, because the world's humanity is also entering this march for a new peace movement and Afro-Asiatic reconstitution. And yeah, I just want to go back to how important I think it is to say that war is white supremacist. War has its roots, I think, in white supremacy. And that's why it's so important to call what Israel is doing as genocide. And the way the Israeli government and Zionists act desperately, the way they behave, their rhetoric is really not so dissimilar from white supremacy in the US, Jim Crow South, the Nazis, and also it's to say that peace, I think there's no total, this is what King said. He says, there's no such thing as total, complete freedom until there's peace, until there's no war. And that is why Black liberation must enter the natural next step of Black liberation, the higher struggle, is that of the peace movement. And yeah, and that's also to say that that's why I think James Baldwin's words of it's time for the American people to make America the last white nation is so significant, to make a new, to make a new civilization, so naturally going along with the Afro-Asiatic reconstitution of the world, that America, through this peace movement, through an unfolding new emerging peace movement in the US, is also the roots of an Afro-Asiatic reconstitution. Just hearing the way Candace Owens talks, I actually think it's part of the Afro-Asiatic reconstitution of new values. So that's just what I wanted to say.
Oh, wait, can I say something? No, I just wanted to add to what you both said, which was really clarifying. Well, I just wanted to say that today's discussion, it makes me think about a common Du Boisian or Kingian framing, where he will say like the world in Africa, or democracy and peace. But yeah, I just think it's very free school like, and also very important that we're talking about what's happening in the Middle East, but we're also talking about how it links to what's happening in America politically and spiritually and morally, and then also the world. And I got that a lot from what both of you were saying, and I thought that was important because I actually wanted to discuss more this point that you had brought up in your presentation, Tony, where you talked about the invincibility psyche of the Israeli people. I thought that was interesting because what I'm trying to get at is, for me, it's a historic aberration that Israel and the Israeli people have been able to develop in this way. And the way I'm basically interpreting what both of you had said is that the historic pendulum has no choice, given the advancements that have been made in the 20th century, especially of the peoples across the world. Like, it has no choice but to swing back toward humanity. And Israel, the Israeli state as it currently exists, will have no choice but to renew itself or perish. And I think that, for me, that's a question. Will Israel become a civilization, or will it perish as the state that it is now? No, but the invincibility thing is really on my mind because, yeah, to Emily's point about white supremacy, a la the Jim Crow South, it's been 100 years since then. So why is it possible that the white supremacy in the Israeli form is capable of existing as it does now? Because my question is also how that's connected to US neocolonialism and how much of it is an export of American racial contradictions. But it's complicated to me because I had also listened to some interviews of Zionists on YouTube, and the way that they talk about the Palestinian people is, for me, it's a historic aberration. That's just, it's just a plain way for me to put it, but it's very anachronistic, where they are seen as subhuman. And I actually wanted to read this passage from John Brown, which our conversation was reminding me of, John Brown by W.B. Du Bois, because I didn't realize he had done this until I picked up the book again recently. But he entitles the first chapter Africa and America. Yeah, and I just wanted to read 2 paragraphs. But he talks about the price and the consequence of the transatlantic slave trade on America and the world. And he says, the price of a repression is greater than the cost of liberty. The degradation of men costs something both to the degraded and those who degrade. While the Negro slaves sank to listless docility and vacant ignorance, their masters found themselves whirled in the eddies of mighty movements. Their system of slavery was twisting them backwards toward darker ages of force and caste and cruelty, while forward swirled swift currents of liberty and uplift. So when he says they here, he's referring to the American people, but he says they still felt the impulse of the wonderful awakening of culture from its barbaric sleep of centuries, which men call the Renaissance. They were own children of the mighty stirring of Europe's conscience, which we call the Reformation, and they and their children were to be prime actors in laying the foundations of human liberty in a new century and a new land. Already the birth pains of the new freedom were felt in that land. Old Europe was begetting in the new continent a vast longing for spiritual space. So there was builded into America the thrift of the searchers of wealth, the freedom of the Renaissance, and the stern morality of the Reformation. I like these two paragraphs a lot because he's writing this, I think, around 1908, and he traces the lineage of the new American people to like a few specific countries where he says, okay, from France, you know, they drew the Renaissance philosophy. From Holland, they drew this or that. I forgot exactly what he was referring to. But the way I interpret it is it's like the first beginnings of Baldwin's later formulation that America is very well poised to become the last white nation, because even when the Europeans were migrating to America, there was already the stirring of a new consciousness. This was not going to be an aristocratic nation. But then the other thing that I wanted to highlight was this thing he said about how civilization is brought back into the darker ages by slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And he says this elsewhere too, maybe in The World in Africa, where he explicitly says that it's a regression of civilization in a way that is antagonistic with the way the world has already moved. And yeah, for me, that's just the framing that I view Israel through now at this moment. But then my lingering question is like, how's it been able to persist? Like, why? How's it been so well concealed from the American people? But the last thing I just wanted to emphasize again is, like, I agree with both of your formulations that this is opening up a new world peace movement.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I think what you were saying about, this change of narrative that we're seeing now, I thought that was very important because, like, when I was reading, like, what I guess Emily and Michelle were also talking about, I was reading the essay by Baldwin on, the dangerous road before King. And he talks about this moment in the 60s where, like, he's saying that the children of this time, the students and the youth, they are not going to hold on to the old narratives anymore, that this is a profound moment. And that's sort of how he frames like the road before King, because King is at that time faced with these challenges because at that time the NAACP has been compromised, Zubas has left it, and like that represents the black male leadership class. And he's talking about like how King has to make this choice, and he is making this choice. And at every point he's talking about how the youth of that time, they are finally prepared to make a fundamental break with how people think about the question of war and the question of civil rights at that time. And what you were saying about like in the question of Israel and Palestine, the narrative that has been changing now, I think it's like it really makes, I think it makes everyone think anew about this question about, okay, what do we mean when we are talking about for example, this question of revenge, because you mentioned like the idea of, okay, like sure, like after the October 7 attacks, of course, like people from like the Hamas fighters, they moved into Israel, and there is this sense of revenge for like years and decades of humiliation. But on the other hand, like when we pick up like something like the Financial Times, which like it represents how the ruling class of America is really feeling, is how how it's thinking. You see how they describe the question of like even the question of hostages and prisoners, because they talk about like they talk about the Israeli hostages in Gaza as the women and children of Israel, but they talk about the Palestinian prisoners who we see are also children. But that's how they are trying to frame this question. But this is this is what I feel like the break that we are seeing in America now, and like all over the world, but especially in America with the with the new anti-war movement that's really blooming, is that people are not going to be fooled by these lies anymore. They can see that the way that language is used is representative of something much bigger. It's representative of how the ruling class operates. And this is the moment where young people everywhere are realizing that there is something larger to be fought for. And this is a moment, I mean, we have been talking about this for a while, but this is a moment where like new I guess new kinds of social relationships are being forged because people can see through the lies of how these questions have been framed. I mean, even a couple of years back with the with the Russia and Ukraine conflict, with Ukraine and NATO, you could see how the same sort of the same kind of framing about democracy, about democracy and authoritarianism, and this was still taking enormous hold, at least in at least in the liberal and academic sections, like the second kind of youth that Emily was saying, I guess. But now this this moment shows that that narrative no longer holds anymore, because people can see that this is exactly the logic that was fueling the war against Russia. And now this is this is at a time when it's extremely clear. There is there can be no confusion about this question of hostages and basically genocide that you're seeing right now. So yeah, I thought it's what you were saying about the change of narrative. I think that really says something profound, which everyone is working through it at this time, and young people everywhere they are trying to break through it. The other thing I was going to sort of bring back is this question of, I guess, the question of India, because it's true that the anti-war movement is nothing in the world like it is here. This consciousness of the American people, because they have been I guess on some level they have in terms of the intellectual affront, the American people have been affronted more than any other people, because they have been sold these lies the hardest for decades. And this has this has prepared the American people, I think, to see to see through the propaganda that the ruling class is constantly engaging in. But places like India and so on, this is the task of our times, where people really have to learn from America and learn from the Black struggle. I guess that's what you all were talking about, because this is the time where the Palestinian movement, even the Electronic Intifada was talking about this. One of the commentators was saying this, that this is a time where since you have this moment where young people and radicals and leftists and so on, even even those sections of the youth in America, they are seeing this as a moment of breakthrough, that this is a time where you have to be constantly aware that the place that you anchor yourself is not the progressives, is not the Democrats, it is the Black liberation movement. And this is what the world needs to learn at this point. Okay, go ahead.
I was thinking in similar terms to Shambarto, because this doc, your introduction, and then the conversation that followed reminded me of how Garland Nixon in the conference in his presentation on neocolonialism, but specifically on Israel-Palestine, said that this war signifies a war against modernity, or a war to stop time, that sort of thing. And I've always struggled to understand what the implications of modernity is. And the reason for that is I think its true meaning has always been obscured by Western propaganda in some ways, because in one way of thinking about modernity, it's connected to, sort of advancements, say technological or material advancements of humanity. But then I am sort of trying to make sense of modernity in the sense of what stage of human development are we confronted with right now. So tying it to the human, to basically how the human being thinks about the world or knows the world, and how human social relationships are shaped by this kind of an understanding or epistemology. So, this question of modernity is so, I think, becoming clearer and more important right now, because, even about the American elections that are coming up next year, before October 7th, before this, war situation started in the Middle East, we were talking about how in free school, we would always talk about the American elections necessarily being grounded in questions of war and peace and the economy. But since the Israel-Palestine conflict started, it has given it a qualitatively almost a new dimension where it has sort of pushed the moral imperative to the forefront of people's consciousness more than was possible with just the Russia-Ukraine situation, where in the Russia-Ukraine situation, you could talk about, okay, why is America funding Ukraine instead of funding, welfare programs? Why is it not combating poverty and unemployment and homelessness and addiction in this country and using instead that money to support what can only be called, basically again a Nazi, army that's and this entire narrative of Russia as an autocratic state. But with Palestine and Israel, it's more visceral, the reaction, and it's more rooted in the moral. And the way I don't know if I'm fully getting this right, but this is also making me think that the question of modernity in our times has sort of become inseparable from the moral imperative. And like, you can no longer separate the moral imperative from how you understand modernity, like you can also no longer separate peace or a peace movement from the conception of modernity. And this is why I also agree with what everybody was saying about the centrality of the Black struggle, because I don't think there is a stronger example of a mass struggle that was so rooted, so clearly, unequivocally rooted on the moral. And this idea that white supremacy is immoral, war is immoral, and ultimately, yes, racial justice and civil rights and all of that, but ultimately we are really fighting for the moral, the human dignity, and we're fighting for peace. And this is also why I guess it's so disappointing to see the Indian government's cowardice in how they have really put forward public statements on this conflict, always hedging, talking about Palestine, sending aid to Palestine, but refraining from calling out the Israeli state as genocidal. And I do think that this is because of how they've separated themselves from the Indian freedom struggle, which was also rooted in the moral imperative of overturning an unjust system, overturning a white supremacist understanding of the world and what it said about human capacity. And it's because they've cut themselves off from the freedom struggle, sort of tried to bypass it in their understanding of what modernity is. They face this situation now where you can't really make sense of what's going on, and you don't have the courage to stand up and say India has historically done that. Indian support for Palestine during Indira Gandhi. I mean, Yasser Arafat and Indira Gandhi. Yasser Arafat called Indira Gandhi his sister. So it's, yeah, I don't know how to finish my thought after this, but yeah, these are some of the things that I was thinking about. Okay.
I had a couple of things to add to what Shambarto and Purba were saying. The first being this utilization of language. It was, I think, just yesterday, I was reading about this recent exchange of hostages between Israel and Palestine. And I think I had to read that part a couple of times to understand what was happening. But they said that we are going to exchange Israeli women and children for Palestinian females and teenagers. Now, it's a subtle difference, but they have kept at this narrative where they have humanized the Israeli side, the Israeli hostages, and they have consistently dehumanized the Palestinian people and the Palestinian hostages, the children who were imprisoned for throwing rocks at Israeli military. They were imprisoned for 20 years for throwing rocks at them as children. And this really goes to show who is the more dehumanized population, or I wouldn't say population, I would say the more dehumanized authority in charge. Whereas whereas women and children humanize and evoke sympathy, the word female can be used for any animal species as well. And that's dehumanizing, really. That's dehumanizing. And I had a few other things to say. That recently, I think Purva and I were watching this interview of Martin Wolf, the economist, on Brianna Joy Gray's show.
Richard Wolff.
Oh, sorry, not Martin Wolf. Richard Wolff. Sorry. Martin Wolf is the other guy who writes about India. Richard Wolff. And they were having a conversation about how the US can afford to fund 2 wars at the same time when they can't afford welfare programs, they can't afford education and affordable housing and Medicare. And one of the things that really struck out is when Richard Wolff said that the only way that America can get all of this money to send abroad, to manufacture weapons and send them abroad, is by borrowing from other countries. They can't afford to raise taxes because that would incite civil war. So they have to borrow from other countries. And apparently their largest creditor, I think the second largest creditor, is the People's Republic of China. And they borrow money from other nations. And as a result, as we know, the national debt goes up. And when the national debt goes up, interest rates are raised. And when the interest rates are raised, it results in an inflation. However, what people are usually told is that inflation is the result of the economy and so on. A lot of complicated things that nobody can really understand, and that is intentional. But it is a direct result of war funding that the people at home are suffering. What are the major things that people complain about? They complain about their own social welfare and about war abroad. But they are connected. They're intricately connected. One directly leads into one another through steps that are deliberately hidden from the public. But now I think that the public's consciousness, as it's rising, they understand and see more of these things. They see through all of this now. They have the capacity to say that, no, the money that's going abroad is directly affecting our lives here. Apart from this moral stand I'm taking, I'm also taking a stand for the people of my own country. This really points to this crisis of the ruling elite that we were talking about, how the Biden administration has made innumerable mistakes, including putting up this person, like, this is not a mistake, but this is just a stupid decision, by putting up Biden for re-election next year. They have really no possible way of getting through this, even though they are trying really, really hard to give the impression that we are sympathizing with the Palestinian people. But even then, yesterday or day before, I heard that that Biden went and supported Netanyahu's war call. And on this front, I would just like to say, at least I think at this point, just a call for ceasefire is the first thing, but it's not enough. I think the nation of Barcelona recently cut off all relations, every single relation, all diplomatic and foreign relations with Israel. And I think that more of that is necessary, not just a call for ceasefire, but a step to say that we're not going to study war no more. We're not going to support you in your genocidal campaign. And the people are rising and going to be part of this new world peace movement for the future, the better of this coming world.
Just on the aspect of the Muslim civilization that you had talked about, I've been following everything also through like the photojournalists that are like on Instagram, like Motaz Aziz or Sean King. And there's a post that Sean King had reposted about this. I think this like middle class, I don't know where this woman was from, but it was just this white woman who was complaining about her family like being Zionist, and she was like crying, like, how could you, they're the children. But she qualified it with saying like, I'm a Christian and I can't believe, and I was thinking about, and like what you said about how the Ottoman Empire, like its role in history and how it qualifies the Muslim tradition that Turkey will or could or has maybe practice is something I need to understand, because, I don't know the difference or what they specifically, either way, like, it's interesting, the Sunni, the Shia, and like what it makes me think about is how in tandem with everything, or that underlying current of the new possibilities of like human consciousness, because I was also scrolling on Facebook, and there's videos that comes up, and one of them was a choir that was singing in like a marching band in like I don't know what black historically black college it was, but it was saying how it was singing that song about how like God is in you, like God is alive, like God is alive. And I was like, because as it comes to this question of Jesus and who he was as in terms of the makings of Christianity, the religion Black people, or the Jesus that Black people know and understand, is somebody who stood against oppression.
Right.
And similarly to that level of understanding, that Diane Nash, when she was studying nonviolence, knew that nonviolence was a level of consciousness.
Right.
It was a way of interacting, of elevating human understanding, empathy, and relationships, whether that be both in an international or person to person, in terms of the question of like what the people who make up a democracy, or the makings of a new democracy. And so I'm thinking about how, the aspects of religion that deal with the makings of a person, like the philosophical, the moral, they all deal with the choices that an individual makes. And, when it comes to like the Shaheed, or even the quality that I feel like I'm feeling from the people of Gaza who are like, there's photos that Motaz was, he's walking in the Gaza Strip now because he went down, and he's been in there for like the past 3 or 4 days or whatever. And now, like, it was like during the daytime where, there was this shop. He saw he passes these shops, maybe one that was that, you know, relatively is standing, right? And you see a man inside it just sitting there. And you can imagine this whole strip, just markets, you know, fabrics, like items that of merchandise and jewelry and, you know, expensive and inexpensive goods. And then next to his, like, because in his shop, he still has his clothes up and out, like, and the sun is like looking right into his shop. And I'm just like, you know, he's sitting there as if he were to sell his items in his shop still, but he's sitting there like thinking, and then the scene kind of emerges into like this next row that would have been like houses that
just
are
rubble.
It's well not so the structure that was a house isn't completely flattened. So like people have been like climbing inside to see like what was in, what's still to, you know, because they're taking stuff out of what was their homes to either still manage to leave Gaza or, and you know, there's scenes where people have been like cooking. Like people are cooking in the rubble. People are sitting in the rubble with their babies. Like two women who are like sitting with their babies and, you know, they're playing with their children in the house that they lived in that is now rubble, but is still their homes. Because historically it's constituted that they in themselves are struggling to still live in Gaza.
Absolutely.
It's not like they're gonna go ahead and leave because at the end of the day, it's God and also the political situation that you have put together. You know what I'm saying? Iran, whatever. So they're sitting there, and it is an interesting dynamic. They know what has happened to them in the past month. They know what has happened or what could also happen to them in that moment of them just sitting there in the rubble.
Yeah, right.
Like I was telling Doc, when the people are moving out of Gaza, yes, there's still there's a ceasefire from the rockets, but Israel is still putting in troops on the line. So there's still snipers that are shooting actively. So the people in Gaza are like both taking, you know, their stuff, moving, or some are choosing not to move. And you know, that those kinds of scenes. So the rubble is something that can be a question of what the people will make of the rubble, you know, or something of what will be left of the rubble that is of value.
So interesting.
And the images in my mind is very helpful for me to understand the quality of the people that are emerging from Gaza. And when I'm thinking about that thing of the civilization, it's clarifying to me that what happens in this situation with this understanding of God or religion is that, which is not like just religion, but just what I'm saying, like the moral, say our Declaration of Independence, or like what it is that the people, like what do we live by? If that changes, then the people change. So the same thing being said, as if Israel is a genocidal, white supremacist state that is, you know, using, its military equipment is funded by a depleted American people to also make them more impoverished, then what makes of, like, if you go there with that, then you have to also assume that what makes of the American country, like where, how do we define things? All the definitions are now on the table to be redefined. And so I thought back to how important that King movement is, meaning that, you know, to kind of what Michelle said directly, the level of consciousness that was, that people were able to achieve, you know, you kind of have to come back down to what was achieved by the civil rights movement. Right. And the consciousness is similar between the world's peoples. Okay, God is in me. Like God is alive. God is a living God. You know what I'm saying? So then what does that make of my role in history, of my moral commitment to serve, you know, humanity, actually. Humanity being God, or like, you know, so like, to me, a revolutionary is, or to choose to be a revolutionary is on the front of everybody's, you know, that's more of a question in everybody's minds, like, what do I do in a moment where I need to decide where I stand in the world and where I stand at home and so on. So it's like that level of consciousness that Black people, Muslims, or whatever they have is relevant, because it also means that what you're saying, or it comes back down to what you said about, the people pushing the government to reject Israel.
Yeah.
So the people have the power to also define democracy and also make it actualize itself.
That's right. That's right.
I think it's very interesting, like what's going on with like all of like the Islamic world coming together and like the BRICS and whatnot. Because I try to look at like, how will white supremacy be defeated, and like how will people's like hearts and minds change about that. And I see, or I guess people see as well, the world that is like, I guess like civilization being made, with, China help make that peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And now Saudi Arabia is the one calling for this big meeting to happen, and, all of these Islamic countries, but also the world, kind of like remaking its relationships on what's righteous, because, we see that the Palestinian people and the Gazans are righteous, and it's this thing about Israel too, that if they don't remake themselves, they'll be destroyed, because I think the world has decided that can exist, that type of people, that type of ideology, really, that white supremacy, because where they're at, in the middle of Asia, in the middle, in between Africa, it's kind of there like an aberration. It doesn't belong there, with the ideology as well. So unless, and I say that as in escalating to a broader war, that is, because if that happens, they would certainly lose, I think. But so all of these things, and I think about like America as well, because I try to think like, at what stage did we leave off, and at what stage, like, because there are setbacks and stuff after that time ended, but I don't necessarily think we could go back to like a civil rights movement in a way. Like, it would have to probably be this anti-war movement, because how intricately that situation is combined. So like, I guess just in the terms of seeing like this this system of supporting wars and of American hegemony or neocolonialism, this is what gives way to like white supremacy, and this is what gives to that repression of people at home, and reestablishing of a color line, because it's a broader human view, I think. Just listening to as well what Zionists say about those people, you know what I mean? So I guess I just try to think like, because I see that like Americans are like pretty fed up and talking and honestly, taking the moral stand, which I think is, like you guys said, a significant development from the Russian-Ukraine war, because it is undeniable that this is immoral. So I kind of just do wonder, like, where, like, I could see, I guess, where we're at in a way, like we have that important step to kind of claim like where we want to be in the world, because I think if the American people are to successfully stop the United States from funding Israel, then it's just Israel really versus the world type of thing. But I guess, yeah, I guess I'm just curious how it's going to keep playing out, because, you know, more and more it's looking like that. The American people are going to be able to see, like the rest of the world, see these developments of this like peace being made and countries coming together, and also, you know, to look at themselves and reflect. So, yeah.
Emily, do we have any comments?
Oh yeah, we have a lot. Sorry, I kind of lost track of them. But okay, wait, but before I do comments, I also just want to say I really like Nathan's point about that. This is with Serafina and what you said, Doc, about the Muslim world, because like what Nathan said about, isn't it interesting that with in some ways with new relationships being formed, but also in some ways a consolidation of the Islamic world. In some ways, it's also because how Israel is an aberration. Israel is an aberration in such an important part of the world with deep roots of civilization. Like I thought, for me, it's just really beautiful to even think about was it Sunni Islam? Shia, the Persian Empire. Like, yeah, Iran, the inheritor of this great Persian civilization that even fed into India and China, and then also the Sunni Islam and the Ottoman Empire, and just these civilizations that have defined or influenced and given birth to so much of the 8 billion people who represent the world's peoples. And then here you have Israel, like this odd aberration who was not looking to join the world's humanity, but instead was looking to be the one who defined the region, to be the one to say, like, no, all you like hundreds of millions of people, I don't care where you, even though the Zionist narrative is saying that we're the original people, like we are like the original people who gave birth to like the people of this region and whatever. It's just so interesting. But at the same time, there's something really beautiful about like what Nathan was saying, how Iran and Saudi Arabia representing the 2 important types of Islam, and thus 2 very important, in some ways, civilizations, historical civilizations and peoples. Like that China came and played a role in mending a certain relationship, which, because I just see it as part of this Afro-Asiatic reconstitution that gives so much hope to humanity. And yeah, I don't know. I just got it. To me, it was like a very emotional thing when Serafina and Nathan brought up this thing about, once again, what you said, Doc, about like the Islamic world. Because I don't know, in some ways I'm like, because in some ways I think the Islamic world, what's happening is not really just about Islam. It's like, in some ways I see it as like, it's almost, to me, feels like it's like talking about the Islamic world is also talking about humanity in some ways, but just like civilizationally, this whole thing of like Afro-Asiatic and such important civilizations. And that's also because I've always been really interested in Persia as well. Well, that's because of Nandita and Raju. But oh, you're gonna say something, Serafina? Oh, okay. And then you can say something, and I'll do comments after you.
No. You can.
Could I just say something real quick? Yeah, it's also really interesting because you see it's the consciousness of the world's people rising above and throwing off like the United States mediating all of this. You know what I mean? They did this by themselves, you know, and, you know, motivated by these righteous calling, I guess. So it's really something.
I also wanted to add into this what you said, Like I feel like this the protests also the pro-Palestine protests in America are also like very interesting, because I think for the first time, like so many different people are brought together because of their common, like this common cause or this moral imperative that everybody is feeling. Because I mean,
Slow down a little bit.
oh, okay.
Okay,
Yeah. So I felt like even in the protests, like the college educated, like extremely white students came in contact with like a hijab wearing person from like from from Iran, or from even from the Palestinian immigrants here. And I think they've had so much. I mean, that's a place where everybody recognized how much they had in common, and I think that was very moving to see. And to see that, like now these college students have actually a lot in common because of the persecution that they're facing for the positions they're taking with someone like, say, like an organization like the NOI, for example, which has always been labeled like anti-Semitic. Like it is bringing a new kind of like consciousness even among the youth. Yeah, just wanted to add that.
I also had something to say before we go to comments. And it's in relation to what Neha said about the protests, and what Michelle said about the grip that Israel has had on American society, where the vast majority of Americans for a long time, and the world, have always sided with the Palestinians and a just solution, an internationally agreed upon solution. And it's like in America, even amongst progressives, there's this term progressive accept Palestine, where this was a big deal in the Women's March, because the one woman made comments about Farrakhan, and she was called anti-Semitic. But it just reminded me of two experiences I had at Temple as part of Students for Justice in Palestine, where one, we had a meeting with the Queer People of Color Student Union, which was run by Elias, and there was a man who was in his middle-aged man, white man, who was dressed in a suit with a briefcase, who showed up to the meeting and was taking notes. And when everybody got up to go, he got up and he bolted right out, so nobody could talk to him. And it was understood, the Arab students knew that he was a spy, basically, from the Israeli lobby, to take notes on what the students were saying to each other. And it's just, grow up, like, we're students having a discussion. You don't need to spy on students. And then the other experience I had at Temple was Brandon had gotten wind that there was going to be an Ethiopian IDF soldier speaking at the Jewish Center. So a group of Temple students, mostly from SJP, went, and this woman, was paid by the IDF to tour college campuses to speak on diversity in Israel, because that's what they we are calling Israel a white supremacist state, but that's what Israelis or defenders of Israel will say, is that, oh, haven't you been to Israel? It is so diverse. It is so diverse, but the woman who was Ethiopian, her mother didn't speak Hebrew, and so she called it an enclave, but I called it a re-education camp. She's in a re-education camp for Ethiopians so that they can better integrate into Israeli society. But what is Israeli society? Israeli society isn't even integrating into the Middle East. The language, Hebrew Standard, is an artificial language. It's not native to that area. It has a lot in common with Yiddish. A lot of Russian speakers live in Israel. So what Zionism has done is it's taking these people from all over the world, the Mizrahi Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, the Sephardic Jews, and it's erased their culture. And that's why people say that Zionism is anti-Semitism, because it's erasing all these beautiful Jewish cultures all around the world. And they're basically becoming one artificial white nation, that has more in common with Netanyahu than they do, Persian Jewish culture, which goes back thousands of years. And, it's a testament to how tolerant, and Palestinians are the same way, very diverse religiously, very diverse ethnically. I don't even think that they can understand each other in the north and the south, because their dialects of Arabic are so different. And, in some ways that's been a barrier to national unity, but it's a testament to how tolerant the Middle East is, that there is this diversity that is allowed. For thousands of years, Jewish culture thrived, and it was Zionist Israel that came and compressed it.
Wait, my mind is like going off about this whole thing about civilizations.
Yeah.
Because going back to the photos and videos, photo videos that I've seen, like what the Palestinians did with Palestine, meaning like what was their art, what was their homes, like what was their like it was like that has been a whirlwind of things that I've been going down a deep tunnel into. But like, for example, like inscribed into like their buildings are there like these half suns, or like, the designs, and like where do they come from, how is the influences? And the same thing still says what you're saying with the Sunni and Shia, like what Persia gave to India, or India to China, and like, this whole thing about a democracy or a world democracy also reconciles with the fact that civilizations, ethnic groups are at a stage where not only can they talk to each other, they can relate and learn, because it comes back down to Paul Robeson and how he studied languages, seeing similarities within languages that, okay, he can see that derivative, I forget specifically, but you know what I mean, like derivative, just there's African, or like I'm forgetting.
It's the civilizational belt from Central Africa to the center of Europe. Is it where the languages were more similar?
Well, there's that. There's just a lot in general, and like then I was also seeing how the Native Americans were doing protests for Palestine, and then the South American protests, and like what they're also doing in their protests is their like powwows and cultural gatherings, and like they're wearing their garbs and using their languages, and even in news, like this is a bunch of stuff like with people's cultures, people's traditions that are also being used, because essentially people are for peace, like the world civilizations are for peace, people are for peace, and so like literally, like what I mean by that is that what gears civilization is peace. It's not war. And through that is similarities. Are there parallels? Are there things to learn from one another? And that's the deep thing also about what could be of the new stage of history. And and so the thing about, like, to me, what could be of, like, it's just like an explosion of culture, or like a kind of reawakening of civilization. I don't know much about the only reason why Native Americans are popping up on my like stories and stuff is because I saw like the flowers of the killers of the flower moon, and I started talking about it. So Facebook caught up my words and started shooting me stuff. But I don't know much about them. But the thing is the possibilities of a new, like this new synthesis of languages and culture, I think is just like very, I don't know how to exactly put it besides saying it's a beautiful opportunity.
Right.
But again, like getting through in a similar way that the military, arm of whether it be Hezbollah or Palestine are getting through that first wave, we all have been trying to get through this first wave of imperialist war against the Gazan people.
Yeah.
And just that's why I'm, for the 4-day, hostage trade-off pause thing, it would be very difficult to just see the rockets start again once that pause done, because technically this is like the third day, because Palestine is like, it's like 6 o'clock or something. So it's like, it would be difficult to see the rockets start again. But then it's like, okay, well, if the military goes in there, I know that the imperialist ruling class would be like, oh, see, look, the terrorists are like coming against. We knew this would happen if we paused for a day or whatever. So things are like, in this.
But it does complicate it for Israel and the United. The pause complicates the situation, because how did they go back to what they were doing previously?
Right. I'm really thinking about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's to be thought about. Big political, psychological dimension of it, of the whole thing.
Anyway.
I'd like to delay your comments even further. So I've been thinking about what we've been talking about, which is this world revolutionary process being an anchoring in civilization and a moral elevation. Because I was just reading, because Jahan was hipping me to some articles about the role that Israel played in the, I guess, function of neocolonialism in the world. I was reading it a lot, especially about in Latin America, how Israel was providing weapons to basically all of these reactionary regimes and paramilitary forces that were massacring the people. They were training the personnel and managing their intelligence operations. And this is why the countries like Bolivia, Colombia, and Chile are putting, I guess, cutting back on their diplomatic relations. As part of that memory is still alive. And so, of course, there's this, practical dimension to the role that Israel has played in world oppression. And the American people are getting hip to this too, in terms of their tax dollars and the neglect that this government is doing. But that's not what I see as like the primary driving force. What everybody is talking about is this moral elevation, that we are not going to be able to live with oppression any longer. This is unacceptable. And this is how I even viewed, for example, the Second and Third American Revolutions. Second American Revolution of fighting against slavery and Reconstruction. It was the Black proletariat asserting their dignity and refusing to be enslaved. And of course, it was a strategic moment when there was division in the country, and they had the power to essentially withdraw their labor from the plantations to help crush the South when they tried to secede. But it was ultimately a moral assertion of their humanity to say this kind of treatment of human beings unacceptable, and we're going to assert our dignity. Same with the Third American Revolution. This kind of treatment of the human being is unacceptable. We're not going to be a second-class, third-class citizen in this country. We are brothers. I view this I guess world situation with Israel in that vein. That people say we cannot accept this kind of treatment of the human being. We're not going to be a part of this. Of course, like I said, practically speaking, it affects all of us, but I don't think that has been the principal concern. I think people are becoming more aware of that. It's really this human being that is central. And so, this world revolutionary process is a beautiful thing and continuation. And the American people have been a part of it, and the world has been a part of it. And this is this is what's happening in my eyes, and I think it's a beautiful thing, despite being a very painful experience.
Yes, I'm sorry to also delay the comments, but I also just wanted to process a bit of what's been going on, what we've been talking about for the last few hours, but also just what is really, I feel like nowhere else are you really seeing all the pieces that we're talking about. You read one story here, once you see one video there, but we're talking about something really being able to synthesize this and being able to talk about a future that's emerging, that's on the horizon. And I think it's really special. And I feel like everything that something that has been, I think, initially triggered by Michelle's question about neocolonialism, but also I think starting to come out from a lot of what other people were saying, including what Eddie, you were saying, which is that I think, Doc, when you had mentioned that South Africa surprised you a bit when they, took such a strong stance against Israel and has been taking them to court for violating human rights, has been cutting off diplomatic ties as well. It just made me also appreciate more, made me more curious about the parallel or experience of fighting apartheid in South Africa and how that undergirds like a great deal of, but maybe not necessarily everything, because, you know, there's been so much compromise in that leadership since the fall of the apartheid regime. But could this be a moment where, you know, the memory of even, I mean, that was like a 50-year-long apartheid movement. It also was quite an aberration if you think about this tiny white minority trying to rule on Africa, like on the African continent, but then even the way they ghettoized and made so many, like the Black African population, and then how all these uprisings had to take so many different forms, some of them quite violent, to be able to, you know, try every tactic and strategy to reach that sense of post-apartheid government or like system. And I think there's something to that, or even the way the world was mobilized around the anti-apartheid struggle. And I feel like I get that a lot from when you, Doc, and Catherine talk about being part of the organization that Henry Winston also helped conceptualize, whose name is still on that I cannot probably do justice to, but the sense that even so many different civil rights movements leaders went on to extend the civil rights struggle. Obviously, the parallels between the Jim Crow South, also the apartheid South Africa. And so there's just something about the world also coming together in that moment, even calling for some of the same tactics around like boycotting and divesting, which has been also revived in the against Israel in more recent times. But I do think there's something about all of this that's not just, I think, lessons to be learned or looking to the past or seeing just these parallels, but also the sense that could this also be a new moment for South Africa to, I think, fully embrace its role, such as how it's taken on a larger significance in BRICS, but also how like more, I'm just really curious about the direction Africa is going to go in because of because it's very clear white supremacy has been so like it's so clear now, like what Israel represents and the way they treat, it's just a complete, it's the sense that Palestinians are not even people, or they're not even animals to be able to. And so there's just something there that I find really powerful, that I think that civilizationally could also be, I guess we're going to be watching that very closely, what the role of, countries like South Africa, but also just, there's a lot there that I'm really curious about.
Real quickly, before we go to comments, I wanted to respond to Serafina and the civilization discourse, which was, for a long time, Israel has been slaughtering all kinds of Arabs, and now they're going so far as, banging the drums for war against Persians who are not Arabs. I don't understand why all of a sudden Israel needs to fight, Iran, who has never, they say that Ahmadinejad threatened them by saying we'll wipe you off the map, but that was a bad translation. Iran has never even threatened Israel. And what you said, Doc, about Turkey and Iran entering a war against Israel means that it would be, multiple civilizations. It would be Arab civilization, it would be Turkish civilization, Persian civilization, and I've been thinking a lot lately about pan-Arabism, and maybe pan-Arabism had to fail for pan-Asianism to succeed. And there's a foreign minister of Iran, I think his name is Javad Zarif, and he said to America, we ruled the world, the known world, for millennia. Not millennium, millennia, as in plural. Who are you to be, speaking like this? Like, we understand what it's like to be on top, and so we have the humility. America has ruled the world for 50 years and has already lost control. Have some, humility. The Greeks, the Persians, the Turks, at one point they ruled all the seas in the world.
Okay, at long last, our comment section. I mean, I'm always happy to delay comments just to make it clear that because I like everyone's comments on the live stream. But I also love the contributions of our live stream comments, which I'm now going to read, which is Jake says, "Good morning, everyone." So I'm going back to the good morning because it's always nice to hear. This is me also affirming all of our live stream commenters who say good morning. I really love when you make yourself known. So Jake says, "Good morning." Future Homestead, one of our longtime listeners, says, "Good morning, comrades." Marty in New Mexico says, "Morning, Free School." And Future Homestead, I think, wanted to ask a clarifying question for you, Doc, about, I think it was when you were talking about, I forget if it was socialist or communist, but that people thought that Israel would be socialist. So Future Homestead asks, why did they think it could be socialist, it being Israel? Was the state not founded by the Zionist project, which explicitly stated its aims for a Jewish ethno-state? So that's just a clarifying question of, during that time, why is it that people thought Israel would be socialist? I'm not sure if you said that, but clarifying question.
I did. There was that. There were two motivations, and what everybody said, the moral question of a people who were almost completely wiped out from Europe, and that was the Jews. That was the moral question, and no one could turn their back on that. And the sense that many Jews felt that they were unsafe in Europe after World War II, and the world had to find an answer to it. The other side of it was that the progressive forces, along with the moral, was the question that this Israel could develop as a socialist, democratic, and peaceful country. That's what was. Now, whether there were adequate political reasons for that is a question that I can't answer. But it is clear that the United States government under President Harry Truman, delayed recognizing Israel for fear that it would be a pro-socialist, pro-Soviet, even with communists in the government, because so many Jews were communists in Europe, and that the Zionist influence would not be what ultimately it became. And that's why it took the first war, Israeli war against the Arabs, to consolidate or to bring to power the Zionists. You know what I'm saying? So it was not an inevitability, but yeah, that's what I would just put it that way.
I also wanted to add that, Doc, your comrade, Hyman Loomer, he writes that there were British imperial officers in the Arab armies that attacked Israel on 48. And, so often, pro-Zionist people will say, well, oh, the Arabs attacked us. And that little known historic fact about the British dividing and conquering in the Middle East is always left out of the Zionist narrative because they got what they wanted from the British. And, the Zionists were attacking the British. They used terrorism to found Israel. They blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. That was obviously one of many tendencies in the Zionist movement, which many of those people were immigrants from the Soviet Union and the Ukraine, and they had a different there was Bundism in Eastern Europe, and to this day owning private property is not allowed in Israel. It's all land owned by the state, and you're leasing the land, so property is very expensive. This idea that America and Israel are friends is a complete fiction, and it goes back all the way to 48. And it really only, it was America that pulled Egypt and pulled France and Britain out of Egypt and opposed the war there. And it was Israel that attacked the USS Liberty to draw America into a war into Egypt. And I thought it was deep when Shantanu brought up inflation and the peace movement and how the war machine has to do with inflation, because like at the Black Strategy for a Black Agenda conference, Joe kept on saying every war is a currency war. Every war is a currency war. But this idea that Israel is America's indispensable friend is a fiction, and we don't need to believe it. And the idea of a completely international pariah Israel is on the horizon.
So Christopher Romero, another one of our longtime listeners, also says, "Good morning, everyone." And then Future Homestead adds, "Rumors are circulating that Israel stole bodies from the hospital to stage photos they just released of the concert massacre." So talking about when, Doc, you were talking about the festival. Children in the pictures don't recall there being children at the rave. So that's just highlighting also how difficult it is, so many competing narratives, and how difficult it is to even get the facts when the media is part of the military industrial complex. But Christopher Romero says, "The comment on asymmetrical warfare has me thinking that the most effective tool against it is demoralization. As long as the people have the drive to fight, even till death, they have an advantage." BK asks a question for you, Doc. He asks, "Doc, do you think it is plausible that global banker elites allowed the Hamas ambush, like the 9/11 attacks, in an effort to garner Israeli support for Bibi and justify the total destruction of Gaza and pave the way for the Ben Gurion Canal project?"
I don't think so. I'll just say that I don't think so. There's too much evidence to the contrary, and how this has worsened the crisis in Israel and made the calls for Netanyahu to get out of government, even from the United States. I don't think it has worked to their advantage, and therefore I don't think that the international bankers, as it were, as they are, could have engineered this. I don't.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then actually BK has a second question, which I also find interesting, because I've also heard there's a lot of online discussion. I remember when October 7th attacks first happened, there's a lot of discussion about like conspiracy theories, essentially. But so BK's second question is, George Soros's foundation has donated millions to pro-Palestinian groups over the past decade, including Jewish Voice for Peace. One can only wonder what that serpent's intentions are. Divide and conquer? ?
Yes, but then everything, the fluidity of the situation. Who could have ever thought? And Samir can tell you this. I mean, we had Students for Justice in Palestine, and on the edge was this group called Jewish Voices for Peace. I don't know how seriously anyone took them if you go back 5, 6, 7 years ago. And suddenly they emerge as this unbelievable organization. I don't think Soros, I don't think anyone could have foreseen Jewish Voices for Peace and Not in My Name and Code Pink, which is, many Jewish people in that, or who could have, in other words, everybody, it turns out, was not for sale. And that's the important thing, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also the other thing, when I was looking at BK's question about Soros's funding, I also feel like that's why I also think the discussion around the 2024 election is really important, because even if George Soros has funded these groups, I feel like there's also the most important question that will come up is, well, all these groups that have been disappointed in the Biden administration's explicit support and funding of a white supremacist regime in Israel, will these groups be trying to turn out people to vote for Biden, or will they say, no, like our members will not vote for Biden? I feel like that is the important question, because I even think that's the important question for labor unions, for example, where there are a lot of labor unions that are being forced to come out in support of ceasefire. But the real question will be not just ceasefire. The question will be, but do you support the war policies of the Biden administration? Not just what it means for the Israel-Palestine conflict and what's genocide and ethnic cleansing in Palestine, but also for what it has done to the working class of America. Because we all know George Soros, at the end of the day, George Soros is funding a lot of his support for even progressive DAs. Like we talked about this in the free school, is at the end of the day, it's about keeping a ruling elite that is primarily in the Democratic Party in power. And so I feel like the real question will be whether these groups, like all these various groups, are you going to continue to take a stand against the Biden administration? And then Tracy Ford says, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the needed assistance and cooperation, comrades. I think it's her support for us. And then Julian Thompson, our friend, says, thank you for today's free school praying hands emoji. And then Amiri Bank says, Eddie and Serafina's points underscore that rejecting, underscore that embracing an Afro-Asiatic Eddie and Serafina's points underscored that embracing an Afro-Asiatic reconfiguration is not a rejection of Indigenous and Latino culture and history, etc., but rather an embrace of how interconnected they are to the histories and languages of peoples all over the world, especially given how much the Palestinian people's current experiences parallel those of folks in the Americas. BK says, okay, thank you, in response to, yeah, it's so nice because we're commenting in real time and we're getting feedback in real time too, because, you know, we always wish that all of our online listeners could also be in the same room with us physically. Yeah, well, actually, off of Amiri's comment, something I was thinking about earlier was, I think maybe it was, I forget if it was Shambarto, Shantanu, or Purba who said this, but I think there's something really meaningful, but also deep that when we talk about the Afro-Asiatic reconfiguration, I also feel like what's happening today in the world with people's consciousness and the people of the world demanding something of their governments against white supremacy, against imperialism, against neocolonialism, and to be on the side of humanity, which is to be on the side of peace, that actually in some ways what intertwines all of us in this current form of this new peace movement, or this new peace struggle, is actually, in my eyes, I see it as the garment that's connecting all of us is actually the Black liberation struggle of America. Like in some ways, I do feel like it is the Afro-American, whether it's memory, legacy, the memory, the legacy, like the Black proletariat. I just feel like that is in some ways what ties all of us together in this new peace struggle. And the reason why I also say that is because when I heard Shambarto even talking about India, or Nanata and Raju's statement they wrote to the Indian people about taking a stand with Palestine, despite what the government is doing, or even when we talk about Korea, for example, I feel like it makes so much sense at how necessary Martin Luther King Jr. or James Baldwin or Du Bois and everything he wrote on peace and democracy, that it's not just a message for America, but actually a message for all of humanity to face ourselves and to take a stand. And I don't know, for me, that's what I was also thinking about, how what interconnects the world's people is in some ways, I don't know, I do feel like it comes from the Afro-American struggle. And that somewhere like South Korea or India needs James Baldwin, or Israel, or even Israel needs that message of Baldwin as much as the American people do. And I also feel like that's because the crisis of neocolonialism is the intertwined crisis of the ruling elite in America. I saw you're gonna say something, Serafina.
No, I was just gonna underscore your point, because the episode, I think I heard the same episode of the Electronic Intifada where I don't know who runs it or who the hosts names, but they were interviewing a Palestinian who's talking about his friend who had recently been martyred, but he had met his friend at one of the universities in Palestine. I also forget the name of it, but they had a teacher. I forget where this teacher is from, but he wasn't Palestinian. I don't know if anybody else saw this episode, but the teacher was teaching his students. And by the way, the guy being interviewed was like, this was my hardest teacher. Like, he was so difficult, but he appreciated how, and that showed me a lot about, or like when he was talking about the universities and like the students that go wanting to be like scientists and like, like, it's just, yeah, that's nice. But he was teaching about Malcolm X, and what he had underlined is the fact or struggle to be free thinking, to struggle against what is, oppressing you. So it wasn't maybe, and it was also interesting if Malcolm X, has that kind of like, I don't know. Anyway, I was just like, well, he could have been teaching King, but Malcolm X is also interesting. It's not like a giveaway. He's not taking away or whatever, saying anything about solely Malcolm X. But it's what you're saying. I'm seeing it. Like, another Palestinian photographer had mentioned how the racism of an Israeli is like the white supremacists of the segregated South, because he had showed a video of a white woman spitting on one of like the Arab, women, and how, racist that was. And he had used Dr. King. Like, he went back to Dr. King on it. And I was like, wow. So it's a recognition on both sides of the coins, like you had mentioned with Candace Owens. And if the Palestinians are being taught Malcolm X, and that, and I know, and that goes back to what I was thinking about with the like the conference happening in China, and like everybody was going over, I forget what it was called anyway, but like the Bandung spirit, that's what they were referring to, so like this whole Afro-Asiatic reconstitution is also something that is palpable within the world's peoples that are our age, that, and what I'm hoping would be the case is that more Black young people can also recognize that and join humanity too, because the thing about the vote, how how Black people are moving to the Republican Party is important, and how we're protesting against, we're not like in mass staging protests. I don't see a lot of Black people in mass staging protests against the Palestinian war, but I do know that Black people are against war, period. So
a different rhythm. Can I just say, and I agree with you, I was just thinking about what you all were saying, and Emily and others, how central the Black struggle is to what is now coming after the Black civil rights struggle. A hardly reported thing, I think someone brought it up in Free School, how highly regarded Martin Luther King is among Gazans. And a few years ago, there was a peaceful march through Gaza, marching towards this electrified fence that kept them in. And the Israeli government fired on them and killed many people. I forget all of the details of that march, but this was only about 10 years ago or 5 years ago. But it was under the banner of Martin Luther King that they marched. And I'm very moved and convinced by what you all are saying about the originary moment may have been the civil rights moment. That the world keeps looking back to it for inspiration. In fact, one could think of the Gazans not leaving the North as instructed by the IDF, staying there as an act of mass civil disobedience, where they are saying, like Serafina was pointing, we're not leaving our homes. Even if you bomb it, this is my home, it's going to remain my home. And this act of mass civil disobedience, I think one of the great contributions that we might be able to make in this process going forward is to redefine what a peace movement is. That a peace movement is a justice movement and is a movement for a new world democracy. And so when the Chinese foreign minister calls for a world conference on peace, focusing on the Palestinian people, he is talking about, when they say a two-state solution, they're talking about the emergence of a new democracy in the Middle East, that is the state of Palestine, side by side with a state that is imperialist and genocidal and anti-democracy. But just like the Palestinian people have triggered this world movement, this world expression of consciousness, so a Palestinian state and all that it will take to achieve it, given the obstruction of the United States and Israel and the entire West, the white world system, of which Israel is a cornerstone of. And this is what we have to see, a white world system that claims to be democracy. And this is what, for example, the Indian government has to reckon with. Are you, by your actions and your statements, trying to reestablish or uphold a white world system that had broken Indian civilization for several hundred years? Is that what you're trying to recreate? It's a great paradox for India. But at any rate, this, and we didn't use the term today, civilization war. A nation that is waging war on human civilization itself. This is what Israel has become. I'm one of these people. I don't spare language to describe this regime, because any kind of watering down or what about this and no. There is no, the best language is the most truthful language. And I think that what Israel and the United States are waging, and the United States and Israel, now it is clear, have been waging wars against civilization, be it Persian civilization or Egyptian civilization or Muslim, however we define civilization. The US and Israel have been waging wars on civilization, particularly towards Palestinians and Arabs, but in the general sense because of the interconnection of civilization against civilization itself. And this is the great danger. And when they talk about a war, and I'm going to shut my mouth, when they talk about a war against Iran, that is a civilization war. If they talk about a war against Turkey, that's a civilization war. And this concept has not been used often because we have thought of wars, modern wars, as wars between nations. But what if these are actually civilization wars all the time? And I think that's what Michelle brought up when she cited the first chapter of Du Bois's biography of John Brown. It is the first chapter is Africa in America. And then almost 40 years later, when he writes The World in Africa, the first chapter is entitled The Collapse of Europe. It's very telling, you know, but that's a
Yeah. We're just because I know how much, Doc, you don't like when we go on mute, we'll tell you what we were saying, which is that we were saying how it's so interesting because Du Bois almost feels like our great-great-grandfather or something, like a relative. And Michelle was like, yeah, he's saying, come sit on my lap and let me tell you where the world is going.
I didn't say lap, I said knee.
Oh, knee,
there's
sorry.
a difference.
I don't know, I think that's pretty deep. But okay, comments. Christopher Romero says, these are times where people need to look in the mirror and ask themselves, who are we? Only through questioning ourselves do we grow. The problem is we have a lot of whitewashing to go against. And then Amiri adds, the Black liberation struggle continues to be foundational for impoverished and darker peoples of the world beyond America. We have always and continue to exchange art, stories, and revolutionary strategy. They can't kill us all. They can't kill the whole world. We are struggling against the ruling elites everywhere and will not tolerate nation states who are against the future of human civilization. And then Christopher Romero says, let them know, Dr. Montero, clapping hands emoji. Okay, so AG asks an interesting question. He asks, so it's not just imperialism, it's white imperialism, question mark. I'm a little confused. Isn't Russia white?
And I'm not using a skin strategy. That's why the civilization war concept, but Russia is a white nation, but not a white supremacist regime. Now, a lot of people say, well, yes, it is. And I would argue, no, it is not. And the history of Russia and then the Soviet Union and all of that is separate, even in the stage of the empire and czars and so on. It is not a part of Western Europe and the rise of capitalism and the transatlantic slave trade. I think, are there white supremacists, even Nazis, in Russia? Yes, there are. But is Russia, especially now that it is found that it cannot accommodate the West and has moved to be what it always was, an Asian nation with a Western educated or elite, I don't even consider Russia Eurasian. I consider it Asian. And civilizationally, the origins of Russia are more in the East than in the West. And that's, and I think that's the way Du Bois looked at Russia and the Russian Revolution. And that's the way Paul Robeson looked at Russia and the Russian language, which are deeper definitions of civilization, language, etc. Just one quick thing. If you've ever been to the Soviet Union or Russia, the people do not look Western European. They don't look like Germans. They don't look like Nordic people. They look more like a mixture of Asian and so on. And to our eyes, we don't know what all Asians. You talk about Central Asia. You talk about Iran, countries like this. Well, they look white, but are they white? You say, well, when they got to the United States, they act like white people. That's in the United States. But the majority of Iranians are in Iran. The majority of Russians up till this day trace a lineage back to one or the other Asian people. For example, Pashtuns and other people in Afghanistan, the great migration of, not even migration, but the Central Asian people and people from the western part of Russia migrating there and becoming Asian. I mean, there's a lot to go into, but white supremacy is most particularly concentrated in the political, social, cultural, and state forms of the West. White supremacy was necessary to justify the crime of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Shut up.
No.
Yeah, I also wanted to just clarify that I don't think we ever said white imperialism. Yeah, so, but Amiri adds another comment: civilizations have lasted forever. They predate modern conceptions of race or identity. Nation states have only existed for as long as Europe has dominated the way we talk about ourselves and others.
Just say this. This is very interesting because, you know, we often talk about Du Bois's conceptualization of the Russian Revolution, which is not the same as the Western Europeans' communist conceptualization. He saw it as an Asian affair, and his notion of the Chinese Revolution is that the ancient civilizations, which never transformed themselves into white supremacist nation states, India, China, Iran, the Muslim peoples, all of that, all of these ancient African civilizations were never transformed into nation states that carried out the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. So not having that history, for example, the Chinese Revolution could move forward without the baggage of white supremacy or even Chinese supremacy, even though they had a concept, very somewhat insular concept of the Middle Kingdom, that the world would come to China because China had knowledge, China had spices, China had so much that the world needed, and therefore China was a middle kingdom between all other kingdoms, if you get where I'm coming from. But it was not an imperialist or colonialist concept, you know, and that, and we see that remanifesting in the statecraft of the current government of the People's Republic of China. It's heavily influenced by Confucian moral concepts, but also by their sense that we were not colonialist and imperialist. It is not in our civilization. I think that's, and you could find this, that, and the other that is, you know, not what we would do, but it never had this Western concept of we will colonize the world, we are superior to the world. Now, what I'm saying is even the Middle Kingdom concept was not a concept. In fact, it was to protect their civilization and to invite those who would to come and learn from China, rather than Chinese going out and imposing themselves on other people. And that is pretty much the way China conducts itself today. It's very interesting. They invite people to come, and if they are invited into other countries, so it could be, as Xi Jinping said, win-win. That is not the Western state form. That is not the Western ideological predisposition.
AG says thank you for your answer to his question or to their question. And then BK says Tartars. I'm not sure what the Tartars are about, but yeah. But do you want to comment? Okay, yeah. I just want to say I think the conversation around civilization, but also civilizational war, I think is really significant. And I think that's also why there's so many comments about civilization in the future. But that's it for comments for now. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed our comment section and our conversation we were able to have with our listeners. AG says, how do we appeal to the white working class in the United States?
Well, I think, and this is why this moment of American history is so important. So much seems so spontaneous, but it is not as spontaneous as it might appear. What we are now witnessing is the crystallization of processes of renewal and remaking that go back, and I agree with you all, to the Black movement. Out of the Black movement came the leaders, the ideas, the optimism, the possibility that we are now feeding into and expressing. And white working people who are not all the same, just because they look the same don't mean they all the same. They're not. Politically, even culturally. But one thing is for certain, the entire working class is being taken down more and more, like Shantanu said, by the wars, the spending on war, the borrowing of money from all over the world, and of course, the economic crisis manifested in this time as inflation that is affecting all of us. Mm. So people are waking up based upon their own experience.
Yeah, even to add to what you were just saying, I think with the white working class, it's not that. I think the question is also interesting because the white working class in some ways has already been part of the anti-war movement through a figure such as Trump. And in that sense, that's why with the free school, we're always saying actually white workers themselves, they're not so removed from Black people, where in like the rural areas that Emily's Union is part of, when we go there, they're actually very similar, very poor, very much also upset with the ruling class. And I think in some ways, like that is also the America that the rest of the world has not yet seen. Because when I was just in China and there isn't a sense of who are the everyday people of America. What their sense of America is the ruling elite of America. The one that is waging wars in the world, the one that is quote unquote if superior, the ones that are quote unquote, like celebrities and have wealth and have power. But I think that is why like white workers, actually the ones that are closer to the civil rights movement through the legacy of the civil rights movement, through King, those are the people that actually the world has yet to see, and like specifically through the civil rights movement.
Well, it's 1:55, and I think it's a good place to stop unless people have comments. I mean, because the reason why I think it's a good place to stop is also because I think at the end of the day, like even at the end of the conversation, what we're thinking about is the future of the American people and the emergence of a new American people, which is, I think, already happening. Like that emergence is already happening, like Alice was saying. And yeah, I liked what you said, Alice, about then in China, people are like, people don't have an effing clue about who is the American people. Because one, the American people, it's not the same. It's like one, the ruling elite is so good at propaganda, and so people only see America as the ruling elite's like bombastic policies and whatever. But also, it's also because I think the American people have always been in the movement. Like, and even my grandpa will be like, he always, when I asked him about the political situation in America, I was like, it's because Doc asked me to ask him, but I was like, what's your opinion on the political rebellion in America? And my grandpa was like, well, I can't give you an answer because I don't know who the American people are. And he was like, I would have to really know who they are and what's happening to them to assess the future. And then he asked me, he's like, well, tell me this. What are Black people saying in America? And it was interesting because and then 2 days later, he asked me, he was like, well, something I've always wondered is, do Black people still face the same level of hardship as the past? He was interested in whether the state of Black people has improved or not, because he was interested in how people understood Obama in particular. Because I remember when my grandma was still alive, she asked me, she was like, so it was during the time of Black Lives Matter when I went to China, and she asked me out of nowhere, she was like, so everyone keeps saying that like there's a lot of police brutality in America. So why is it that you have a Black president, but it seems like Black people are really suffering from police brutality? And she's like, don't you find that strange? And I was like, yeah, that's a great question, Grandma. And so that's just to say that I feel like the American people, it's like, yeah, it is interesting because with free school, I don't know, I feel like we also feel this responsibility and deep love. It's a funny love, actually, but I feel like at the end of the day, you feel such love for the American people who are writhing and struggling to be something for once, to be new and to make life actually real life, not just a slow march to spiritual death. And yes, anyways. Okay, 2 last comments before we end. Amiri says, it's no coincidence that US invasions and proxy wars across Latin American countries were in opposition to revolutionaries combating the ruling elites of nation states legitimized by colonialism. Amiri says, my people were from the country before they came to Atlanta. They always struggled to live and resist with white working class people, but the propaganda was effective. Now the propaganda is crumbling. That's pretty interesting. So anyways, I'm excited to continue the conversation next week at our next free school. Thank you everyone who listened in and also those who commented. We'll see you next week back at the Unitarian Church, right? Or is it Christmas? Oh yeah, back at the Unitarian Church. Bye everyone.